Hey guys, today we'll be talking about the Analects of Confucius 7.5, which does give the previous 4 chapters some emotional depth, with a sense of sorrow about the limited time that Confucius has left to complete his mission, and a little insight on how sorrowful he feels. And yeah, without further ado, let's get started. 7.5. The master said, "I must have been slipping fast. It has been so long since I dreamt of the Duke of Zhou." So, how he says, I must have been slipping fast. The more kind of accurate, I would say, the more accurate translation would probably be like, extreme indeed is my decline. And we'll talk about this later, but first let's get into who the Duke of Zhou actually was. So he was one of Confucius's kind of, I guess, role models, but it was so much more than that. And so basically, he was the brother of the king of Zhou, and he lived during the early Zhou dynasty, and he was one of the people who actually saw the creation of the Zhou dynasty. So he was a very, very early person who lived centuries before Confucius did, and he was often attributed to be the kind of creator or someone who was a master at the Zhou rituals, like the Zhou ritual, musical, political, and moral virtues and systems. And so to Confucius, the Zhou dynasty, or at least the early Zhou dynasty, embodied the height of Chinese civilization, and that's just because there's really been 3 dynasties so far. And in the Analects 3.14, he says that the Zhou took stock of the 2 previous dynasties. Splendid is her culture. I follow the Zhou. That doesn't really mean he is agreeing with everything that the current Zhou dynasty is doing. And yes, he was living during the Zhou dynasty, but it was the late Zhou dynasty and everything was about to collapse. And so actually he was saying that he follows and respects the early Zhou dynasty and the moral order that came along with it. Since the Zhou dynasty incorporated and modeled off of the best parts of the previous 2 dynasties, the Xia and the Shang dynasties, the Zhou dynasty was, but back then, the most refined dynasty so far. And so Confucius, by dreaming of the Duke of Zhou, who embodied all of the cultural order, like the rites, the music, the virtues, and the government that the early Zhou had, he's dreaming of the person who embodies the world that he hopes to restore, which is basically a civilization with virtue. And he's trying to do that by passing on the ancient wisdom of the Zhou dynasty, the early Zhou dynasty, to what is now kind of corrupt and not there anymore. So basically, during the late spring and autumn period, which is when Confucius was living, the Zhou king, the king of Zhou, basically had no actual power. He was basically just there for decoration, I guess. And the real power was trying to be gained by the smaller people, the smaller rulers of each tiny little state. And of course, they weren't supposed to be competing for that power, but they just did it anyway. And basically, the rituals were empty. People were just going over the motions without actually noticing and realizing why they did that and how that can improve them. And basically, nobody was following and doing what they were supposed to do or allowed to do. So although the Zhou dynasty during the late Spring and Autumn period still had the name Zhou and still had the same institutions as it had in the past, kind of the spirit or the virtues or the entire life behind the people that the Zhou people once had was gone during the Spring and Autumn period. So let's see what Confucius is actually saying. So he says, I must have been slipping fast. So again, it can also be translated into extreme indeed is my decline. So what decline? What slipping fast? So this can either be his physical aging, that he's getting a bit old, and that act of hope for restoring the way during his lifetime might be fading. And actually, it could be also a combination of both. So, it might just be decline of aspiration, or at least just hopeful expectation. And this extends more into the next sentence, in which he says, it has been so long since I dreamt of the Duke of Zhou. So it's not really like supernatural in a supernatural way, like of dreaming, like the Duke of Zhou visiting him in his dreams or the other way around. But technically, the ancient readers could have interpreted it that way, but it's not exactly what he meant. So it's actually that the Duke of Zhou and all of the ideals that he embodied, that was so prominent during Confucius's more younger years that he thought about it so much, and he was so engaged in it, in trying to complete his mission of fulfilling the ideal and to restore the ideal, that since he thought about it so much, it appeared, and the Duke of Zhou, and which embodies all of the ideals, appeared to him even during sleep, just like during his waking hours. So earlier, Confucius still dreamed of the Duke of Zhou because he believed that the way of the early Zhou people would be restored in his late Zhou times and through his service and his efforts. And so he traveled from state to state trying to find a ruler who would allow him to incorporate his humane and morally good government and put it into practice for the sake of the people. But now, as he's growing older, he kind of feels the opportunity passing, in which he's starting to think that because of his old age and because nothing is really working, that he might not be able to fulfill his mission in time. And so since the youthful intensity of that dream is gone, he's no longer visited by that dream. So like I said, 7.5 gives an emotional depth to the previous 4 chapters, 7.1 to 7.4. And like he said in 7.1, he loves antiquity and has faith in it. So antiquity, as revealed in this specific chapter or passage, is the Zhou dynasty that the Duke of Zhou lived in. So he misses the Zhou dynasty that the Duke of Zhou lived in, and that's because he lives in the Zhou dynasty right now, actually, but it's a lot different than the earlier Zhou dynasty. And actually, I think I've said this in 7.1, but he's actually not at all saying he loves old things just because they're old. And it's just because he loves the antiquity just because that the early Zhou, the antiqueness of the early Zhou, had a sense of moral order, a sense of virtue, a sense of the way that the current time, or at least during the spring and autumn period, doesn't have or didn't have. And the early Zhou is basically the Confucian ideal, and he sees this antiquity as being worthy of passing on because that it embodies the way, or the morally correct way to live. 7.5 teaches us that to love the way, or to love even humanity, or to love an ideal, is to risk sorrow and even disappointment. And that's because if your ideals are shallow, or if you don't have ideals or something like that, then the disorder of the world won't hurt you as much. But if you're like Confucius, and if you, for instance, love it when people are truthful, then their dishonesty will hurt you. And if you love the way, the moral way, then the society or the world not embodying the way will hurt you. And if you love it when people are benevolent, then their cruelty will hurt you. And so Confucius' sadness is just because he stays faithful and loyal to his ideal, to his moral way, the correct path, or the correct way, or to the correct path to live. And his sadness isn't really abandoning the way either, because as we can see, although he feels this way, although he feels like he can't change the state of the world, the state of the spring and autumn period, or at least the entirety of it, he still teaches his disciples in the same way. He still passes on, he still transmits the ancient knowledge, and he still cultivates his inner character, and he still gives the way to his disciples. He keeps on teaching, he keeps on learning, and at least during his time, he influenced actually a lot of people around him, and a lot of disciples as well. And so after his death, his teachings got even wider recognition, and his teachings are still prominent in China right now, and here we are still learning about what he was like and what he taught. And yeah, that'll be all today. I hope you learned something, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!